The payment screen is used to enter your cash purchases, whether you are printing a check or recording a handwritten check or adding to an ACH payment. The payment screen is also used to enter line of credit purchases if you're using a line of credit account or paying open vendor invoices. Let's go to our payment screen under Processes, Expenditures, and Payments. A large amount of your entries in your transaction screen are selecting items from your various setup lists. And we begin with the fund. You can either, on each of your lookup fields, click the magnifying glass, which will bring up a list of those items for that particular field. In this case, it's a list of our funds. And we can select the CenterPoint General Fund, or you can type in some characters to find that particular item in the list. So if we typed in STR, it found our street fund. In each one of your lookup lists, you can also right-click and there'll be right-click options. So in the fund, it might be one of the areas where you use a set as default. And that would result in every time I close the payment screen and open it back up, if I click set as default at this point, it would default to the street fund being selected every time I open up payments. If I don't want that to happen, because I don't always typically use the street fund, I can clear that default and that field would be left open. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my, my village fund. After you select the fund, it will go to current batch. No batch is a default, meaning when this transaction saves, it's going to post the transaction and do whatever the print option that's set for this entry. If you don't want it to post at this time because you have other things to enter later, or you just want several transactions to post and print at one time, then you can create a batch. And you can either have the batch already created from Processes and Batch Transaction, or you can right-click and do New and create the batch right here. And then you would select the same batch for all the transactions that you want posted in that particular batch. Now we're going to tab to the next field, which is our bank account. And again, we can select our bank account. This time I know I want General Fund Checking. So I'm going to type in GEN, General Fund Checking. And this might be, even if you're not using the fund as a default field, you might want to set the same bank account that you want filled in every time you pick that fund. So right now, if I click my mouse in the bank account field, right-click and set as default, every time that I select that particular fund of the CenterPoint Village, it's going to fill in General Fund Checking. If I switch back to street, it cleared the field. But if I switch back now to CenterPoint General Fund, it filled in my General Fund Checking, just a little shortcut. After selecting your checking account, it will show you what the current balance is for that checking for that fund. And then I'm going to tab to my next field, which is Pay to the Order of, where we select the vendor that we're paying. Again, we can click our lookup. And in our lookup, if we have a new name that we haven't used before, we can click the new from here, and that would bring up a detail screen. Or if this was a name that we know that we're probably not going to use again, you can choose new one-time use. That brings up a modified name information where all I'd have to do is fill in the name and save it. And when this new one-time use name is saved, it automatically is inactive in our name list. So when you are in the future looking up your name list, it will show only the active ones. There is a checkbox on your lookup screen if you want to see all of your names, like perhaps you added a new one-time use and then you wanted to use that name again. You can uncheck Show Only Active. That will show all of your names now, instead of only your active names. And there's another way to do that. Let's select a name here. And I typed in all, and it brought up two names in my name list that began with all. And from here, I can use my down arrow and my enter key and select all power repairs. And once you select your name, you can right click And there's another way to show all items. This will toggle between show all items or show only active items. Some other right-click options from the name field is review transactions. So I can click review transactions. It will go out and do a search of all the transactions in the date span selected up here, which you could change, and give me a list of those entries, which now I could double click and look at one of those entries and just kind of review what I've done before with that particular vendor. Another right-click option is I could edit this particular name from here. So that would bring up the detail. If I needed to change any address information, I can do that from this screen. There's also transaction actions on how you want this vendor to behave of filling in the transaction grid at the bottom once you select the vendor. So I can choose to leave the transaction empty, meaning the grid is just left empty. I can choose to have it recall the last transaction, and it would go, as soon as I pick the vendor, it goes out and retrieves all the information from the last transaction I did for that vendor for this fund. Or I could load the default reoccurring, and that would be if I have a reoccurring transaction set to this particular vendor, it would load that transaction. I'll show you that. I have a Superior Electric where I have a reoccurring, and the reoccurring button, this backward button now to the right of the name field, lights up in yellow. That indicates there's a reoccurring set, and this screen will indicate what the reoccurring transaction is, and if it's set at the default or assigned. You can also toggle between looking at all of your different reoccurring that you have available or just the ones that are assigned to this particular name. And there are other videos on reoccurring transactions using those two to help you with that. Once I have my name selected with the reoccurring, it fills out the grid of what that reoccurring transaction was. And this reoccurring button, if you wanted to check how that calculation is set, that would show you how that formula is set for that particular vendor. And now a couple other ways that you can use your lookups. And it's asking me now if I want to clear this. I switched names. It's asking me if I want to clear this information or if by chance I want to use this information for this name too. So I'm going to say yes to clear that. I typed in REP and it found repair at service. But there is also a right-click option of doing a contains or begins with. So if I click contains, then what it's saying is every time I type in the characters that I type, it's going to look at not only if it begins with those characters, but also if it is contained within that name. So if I hit my tab key now, it found more things because REP repairs is in all power repairs and emergency vehicle repair and also repair at service. So now I can go ahead and pick the one that I want. So that is the right-click option that's going to be toggling between begins with or contains, depending upon how you want it to behave. And then there are the options on each one of your lookup lists. You're going to have options of how you want that field to respond when you type in characters to look things up. And there is a video on the lookup options, as I mentioned, that'll help you with all those different ways of using that. I'm going to tab now to my next field, which is my address. And the address is filled in with the address that's on the detail screen of that particular name. If I wanted to switch the address, because that can store as many addresses as I want on a name, I can click that lookup button and switch to a different address if I want this payment to now go to this address instead of the business one. And now I'm going to tab again, and it's going to my sequence, which is managing what the check number is that comes up next for this particular fund and bank account combination. I have different sequences here, so I could switch if this were electronic transfer instead of a payment. then maybe I want this to be the check number because it's not going to be a real check that I'm printing. But the payment sequence is retrieving the next number. My last one was 7612. This brought up 7613. And I could change this on the screen here if I needed to. I'm going to tab now to my date. The date is going to default to your system date or the last day of the last month opened up in your CenterPoint accounting. And then to the amount. In the amount, you can leave the amount empty, or if you fill in the amount with an amount, it will default that amount to the amount on your first line in your account grid here of defining what this payment is for. If you have several things that you're paying and you don't know what the amount is, then that's where you would leave the amount empty. And when you put in all of your individual pieces of information of what the payment is for, you would be able to click the adjust amount at the bottom for it to total that. As I am in amount and I hit tab, it's going to go to my memo line. The memo lines print on your check, and they would be any information which is typically your account number. In this case, for my all power repairs, in the detail of that name, I had already indicated that the account number for that vendor is this account number, and I filled it in the memo field on the name, and that's what brought it into line 2. If I wanted another memo on here, I could put it in memo line 1. And then it goes to apply to open invoices. If I had any open invoices for all power repairs, apply to open invoices button would be yellow. That would indicate there are open invoices, and from there I could click this button and look at the open invoices that are holding there and choose to pay anything off of that open invoice, and this would then be a payable payment rather than a cash expense. I'm going to go now to my account field where this is where we're going to define what this payment is for. And again, we have a lookup list that we can do different ways of how we want to find our account. You can do your lookup and see a list of all of your different accounts, or I can type in a couple of characters again. So if I type in REP, it found all of my expense accounts that have repair in it for all of my different repairs. And I'm going to do a maintenance and repair on a vehicle. And then it goes to my next field. All of the fields in your grid can be customized for what you want on the front grid. You can always click this green detail button and see all the fields available that are being used in this particular template. But you can also click on the blue field, on the blue row, and choose Add Remove Columns. And these are other columns that you might want to see. So maybe I sometimes use quantity 1 and I want that on the front screen. Maybe I'm doing using projects and I want that on the front screen. So you can click those fields, and then after you do that, you can also position those different fields how you want them with your green and up and down arrows. So if I wanted project up higher, I could do that, or if I wanted notation way up here, and maybe I don't need that plus and minus, or I could uncheck. I don't even have to show plus and minus if I don't want to. You can uncheck and check any fields, except you can't undo account or amount. Those always have to be visible. And that would redo my screen, and it's going to remember this for the next time I come into this screen. So we have had selected the account, and I'm going to go to the department. And so we're going to say this was a repair for the fire department because we're going to repair a tire. Okay, and we're going to say that was $300. We don't have a project, but maybe we want to go to our detail screen and assign which fire truck that were repaired. So I'm going to look and see, I've got some fire trucks in my assets, and I'm going to say that this was a repair on my fire truck 183. So later I can do a report on all the repairs that have been done on the different pieces of equipment. And we're going to leave quantity empty and click OK. So that filled in that detail, even though we're not seeing it here, and associated account could be another column that we could add to the front screen if we wanted to. On the fund would be used if you are doing a transaction where all of the pieces of the payment are not for this particular fund, but maybe there's another part of the payment that should go to one of the other funds. Like for example, if the bill had another repair for something for the street fund, then you can change this fund here. So if I had another maintenance and repair on a vehicle for a street, and we are repairing a dump truck. Okay, and then I could change my fund to street fund. And that would still make this check out of the CenterPoint Village Fund checking for $500, and the check would be written for $500, but $200 of it is going to the street fund. It would still be under the general fund checking, so you would still need to do a general journal to get that transfer done between the general fund checking and the street checking, but it would make this check be done for the two funds out of the one check. So those are some different things that you can do there, and we're going to tab to the next field now, and we're done with this part at the top, and down at the bottom are our different buttons for printing. So the print button currently has the printer with the check mark in it, and that indicates that it's going to be printing the check and using this printer. If this were an ACH file, because we had set up an ACH for this particular vendor, then the vendor, and in this case it is not set up that way, but the little icon would have ACH and a green check mark. Or if this was not to be printed at all, because maybe it's an EFT payment, then you can click Do Not Print, and the printer would have a red X. If you want all of your things for this particular fund and bank account combination to generally be printed check, you can right click on there again and set as default. So this would always default to printing check if I set as default at this point. The little scan icon is if I have a document that I want to tag on to this transaction and scan to it and attach it. I can click that button, or I can click the paperclip and go and look up a document that's existing on the computer and attach it to this transaction. And there is a video on attaching documents to transactions that will help you with that. The Save button will now be posting this transaction and doing the print options. Unless I had a batch, then it would just be saving it. Clear will clear everything on this particular transaction. So if I go ahead and click Clear right now, that clears everything. And we're going to pick All Power again. The recall, even if I don't have this set to automatically recall with my action here of recall last transaction, I can always recall by clicking a recall button, and we bring back the last transaction I did to that vendor and this fund and bank combination. And the reoccurring would be if I want to now set up a new reoccurring with the information that I currently have in the grid. Then I would click reoccurring and give it a new name of whatever I want to call this, All Power maybe, and save that. That would make this a new reoccurring transaction available for All Power. And I have the options here of how I want it to do, the default settings, and if I want it to load automatically. And then there are other options. I can review transactions. Review transactions brings up the last 10 transactions done to this particular fund and bank account. and I can make changes there from that review screen. Custom field is if you're using custom fields out in your preferences and you have custom fields that you want printed on your checks. The toggle recall by company will toggle between recall by company or recall by company bank. So you can have your recall behave by recalling the last entries done just to the fund or the fund bank account combination. And then there's a set tab stops where it allows you to modify which tabs that are automatically advancing to as you're tabbing through the transaction screen. So maybe you don't always use the memo lines and you don't always want to stop there or apply to open invoice. If we unchecked those, and now let's put our cursor at the date field and tab, it went to amount, and the next field it went to was the account in our grid. It bypassed the memo lines and the apply to open invoice, and so it was just a little shortcut in working through our entry screen. And then refresh will be if you've made some changes on the screen and you wanted to refresh it. There is another option. I'm going to put in another entry here real quick to supplies office. And if we right click on our screen and go to add remove columns, there is a column called line sequence, which is going to show you the order of this transaction. And if you are trying to match up with some printed form and you have several different entries in your payment screen, and perhaps you left one out by mistake, when you're entering them, they're going to be entered in here one after the other. That's how they're going to print. If you want to change that order, for example, if we wanted supplies office to be the first one on the list instead of the second, we could change this to 8. It's going to order all of your lines by 10, 20, 30, and so on. If I switch this to 8 and now click to refresh, it put my supplies office as the first in line now. And this would then be how it would print on the check stub too. So if you're trying to keep that matched up to something that you're referring to, that's how to manage that. And over then on the right, adjust amount is going to be used when the amounts of the grid amounts are different than the amount at the top. Adjust amount will adjust this amount at the top to whatever the grid is defining. So I could do it like that. But if you don't do that and you choose to save it, we're going to try that. We're going to go 330. And now it's different. Our amount at the top is 365. Our amount at the bottom is 360. If I choose save right now, it comes up with a warning telling us that the total of subdivisions does not equal the total amount of the transaction. Do you wish to accept the amounts entered in the subdivision? If you click yes, it'll automatically adjust the total to be match what the grid is. If you choose no, then you can make your corrections and then go ahead and save your transaction. And now we are ready to click save. There is also a help button that will bring up some help whenever you need to on any one of your entry screens. And we're ready to save our transaction, and that will bring up our printing screen, and we're ready for our next entry.